Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Ben Wells. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of PTI Digital. I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about the COVID crisis and asking whether it will force sport finally to adapt to the digital age. Before we go too much further, I'd like to start with a quote. It's one you may have seen, but I think it's one that's particularly apposite for our industry at this time. For me, sport has always been slow, exceptionally slow, to understand what digital is and what it could mean for our industry and for our businesses. Not just the challenges, but also the opportunities. We've been wedded for too long, in my view, to an outdated commercial model, which has been shown up during these times of no matches to be wholly inelastic and not fit for purpose. COVID is very much the tide, the receding tide, which has shown that to be the case. We'll come back to this quote. So what is the digital age? Well, for me, it's summed up perfectly here by these two charts. The one on the left shows the market capitalization of the world's top 10 companies in 2009. And on the right, it's the same top 10 group, but 10 years later on. What you'll see here are two key things. Firstly, in 2009, the top 10 companies were made up of the traditional mix of financial services, pharmaceutical, retail, and energy companies. Only one tech company in there, Microsoft. 10 years later, 2019, 7 of the top 10 companies are technology companies. The other thing which I think is fascinating is looking at the sheer scale of those companies. The biggest company in 2009, PetroChina, would only just have made the top 10 years later on. These technology companies have one thing in common. They are all underpinned by data. Data enables scalable, exponential growth, and this is a trend which is only going to continue. So what is the impact of digital around us? It's not just the biggest companies in the world that have been disrupted. Everything around us, everything that we spend our time and money on is changing. We can see now that sports clubs have a lot more competition for people's time and money. Video on demand, gaming, streaming services, social media. There's been an enormous shift at a macro level in how brands spend their money. 54% of revenue now spent on marketing globally goes onto the digital platforms we talked about on the last slide. The way content is delivered to us has been disrupted. If you look at music as an industry, for example, it's been disrupted twice in just 15 years. From packaged goods like CDs through to downloads and then streaming services. We'd be daft to think it's not going to happen in sport. And technology, both legal and illegal, has sated the demand for short form content. It's not just about technology, this is about changing human behavior. And the fact that we don't want to watch full 90 minutes or 80 minutes of a game of sport these days, we can actually do that now through clip rights and other methods. And the reality is that the impact of all these things is much more pronounced the younger the audience is. And when you look at some of the stats here at the top of the page, we know as an industry we need to engage with younger people. It's going one way and we feel very much stuck in another way. It's always felt to me a little bit like the digital revolution is something that just doesn't apply to sport. We have a failing commercial model, and it feels in the context of everything going on around us, it's getting left ever further behind. So what is that traditional model? I've used an image here of Sisyphus from Greek legend, who unfortunately was doomed to wake up every morning and have to push this enormous rock to the top of a mountain. When he got to the top, unfortunately, he fell asleep and he woke up again at the bottom, and he had to repeat his task for all eternity. It feels very much like our model in sport. Even pre-COVID, the model was finite, totally inelastic. It was limited by inventory, such as tickets and hospitality places, and subject to price sensitivities. And I think we all know that given the impact that COVID has had on people, price sensitivity is going to be an even bigger issue post-COVID. It's limited by new product development. There's not a huge amount of innovation in that space. We don't have the time for it. And most clubs operate in a cycle of season to season, match to match, week to week. We come in from the high of a game at the weekend, coming on a Monday morning, and what are we doing? We're doing the same thing we did last Monday. Same thing happens in July. We get to the end of the season, we review what's happened, and we start again. The reality is that we just do not have enough bandwidth in our businesses to stop and pause and think, are we doing things right? Is this the smartest way to do it? Additionally, marketing is not seen as a long-term strategic commercial driver. It's merely a sales support function. There's no link between spend and return. And as a consequence, there's very little equity being built for the most part in clubs' brands or in their customer relationships. In short, people work very, very hard. I know that. I've worked club side for a number of years. But every Monday we come back in and we're starting from the same place, just like our good friend Sisyphus here. This model is, in my view, no longer fit for purpose and desperately needs disrupting. I'd like to talk a little bit about sponsorship specifically, because again, I think it's an area which needs innovation. For me, in sport, it's been bought and sold too often very badly. It's sold as a proxy for advertising and unfortunately doesn't understand the full power that a beautifully strategized, beautifully conceived and beautifully executed sponsorship can deliver for everyone. In sport, media value remains the key driver, but media is just a commodity to be bought at the lowest price. Sponsorship is limited by product category exclusivity. We have this mantra that you can only have one brand in a sector as a sponsor, but it's also limited by inventory. At some point, we are going to run out of sites to stick a logo on. And as brand spend has shifted, as I mentioned, to hyper-targeted digital platforms, traditional sponsorship feels like it's been left ever further behind. I've already talked about clubs not investing into their brand, to their brand story or their customer relationships. So as a consequence, there's little differentiation between the propositions. If someone can buy the same media value up the road for half the price, they're going to go there. There's no loyalty to the club because there's nothing unique about what a lot of clubs are selling. And the consequence is it's become a race to the bottom and no one wants to win that race. Sponsorship is just seen as a revenue vertical. It's not linked to the club's strategic objectives. It's not adding any value over and above the pure revenue. And to be quite honest, one sponsor could be interchangeable with another. There's no loyalty then built up with the customer base. There's no value created either for the club, the supporters, or the brand. And the result is a huge churn in that sector. A good example here is thinking about the betting sector. We've talked already about the fact that clubs need to engage with much younger audiences, but when your main sponsor is a brand that legally cannot do so, then the left hand is not helping the right hand out. So moving on to COVID, well, the tide unfortunately has well and truly gone out. No matches, no ticketing, no hospitality, no F&B, limited retail, no income. Sponsorships survived for now, but there's a long tail in the corporate market. And many sponsors, I think, when they get to the end of their contracts, will not be able to renew, whether they want to or they don't, simply because they've been hit so hard by COVID. And with so many propositions likely to be in the market at the same time, supply is going to outstrip demand, and we will see that race to the bottom. At a more macro level, there are uncertainties in the broadcast market. Even the big broadcasters have been hit badly by this. And we have to assume that for the majority of us, there's going to be deflationary pressure on sports rights in the next few years. Many clubs, sadly, have mortgaged either existing or future income and other assets they have simply to survive. That's not a sustainable model. And even when fans are allowed back in, we just have no idea how many will want to, or how many others have found opportunities to spend their time and money elsewhere, whether on digital or other platforms. It is a pretty bleak picture. I think we all know that, but I'm here to say today, don't abandon all hope. There is a way forward. It's one that I believe firmly should have been adopted 5 or maybe even 10 years ago, but it's one that's going to require a substantial mindset shift. Even if things do return to near normal, the COVID crisis represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for our industry to right the wrongs of what was already a poor commercial model. It was already broken, totally unscalable, as I said, highly leveraged and atrophying naturally as fan bases aged. You might have spotted a stat on an earlier slide. I didn't refer to it, but the reality is that the week outside of 2 hours of match time represents 99% of the time that we have, yet we focus on those 2 hours. Everything is a build up to that. We need to flip our model and think about how those 2 hours, when we have the maximum exposure, can be a platform for accelerating, rewarding, redeeming, and promoting everything that goes on throughout the week. The emphasis now has got to switch firmly from the previous model of yield management into one where we are creating new value, not just for ourselves, but for brands. That engagement creates data opportunities. What is your plan for those people when they come in? It's not about selling them a ticket. It's about understanding who they are, what they want, what their aspirations are, and how we can start thinking about new product development to service those needs. Think about your sponsors. How would they be excited by the fact that you've now engaged with a whole number of other people? They may never come to a game, but it doesn't matter. These people still want to buy their products. Think about how you can invest in your brand. What is unique about you? What stories can you tell? What USPs do you have that someone cannot buy somewhere else? Avoid that race to the bottom. Avoid the commoditization of your brand. We have to be realistic. The number one priority at the moment for everyone is survival of this awful pandemic. But number two priority, following very, very closely behind, has got to be a resolution not to emerge from this crisis with more of the same. This is, as I say, a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to say, let's reset our commercial model. We cannot assume that COVID is ever going to go away. And if we were to have another wave or a similar pandemic like this, it would be absolutely criminal if we didn't learn the lessons that it's taught us to totally reskin our commercial model. I'm afraid there's no silver bullet. There isn't a quick fix on this. We all like quick fixes, but there isn't one. It's going to require a lot of thought, a lot of hard work, and being comfortable with failing, but failing fast and learning fast. We have to flip our models from a match day model to one which is about 365-day a year engagement with people. It's time, in short, to enter the digital age. If we're not going to do it now, then when? Thank you for listening today. My name is Ben Wells. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at PTI Digital, and we're here to help. Please feel free to get in touch anytime. Thank you.
So hi, Ben. Thank you for being with us and for agreeing to answer a few questions so that we can take a deeper look at some of the issues which you mentioned in your presentation. But before we start, could you give us a bit of a background on yourself and PTI Digital?
Thanks, Chris. It's great to reconnect, and I hope everyone's enjoying the conference so far. I have been around the industry now for more years than I would like to remember, nearly 25. I've spent half of my time working clubside, so working for the likes of Chelsea Football Club, Bath Rugby, but the other side, I've been consulting, and that's what I'm doing at the moment. I've spent the last 10 years, pretty much since I left Chelsea, trying to understand what the digital age could mean for sport, and have tried with varying levels of success to help get sports organisations to transform, taking the understanding what challenges the digital age presents, but also recognising it's a huge opportunity. It's our second industrial revolution. Change is happening around us a faster pace than any time since the first industrial revolution. And I think now with the threat of COVID and what the post-COVID world looks like, I think that threat and opportunity is magnified. And I think sport is at a tipping point, and that is sort of where PTI Digital are playing. We work with a number of rights holders in sport and entertainment around the world, a mixture of clubs, leagues, venues, and we are helping them to understand how they can harness the power of the digital age to transform their businesses from 30 day a year event businesses into ones which are always on, always acquiring customer data, always learning, and always finding new ways to monetize that insight.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. And yeah, I do want to touch on a few points which you made in your presentation. And one of them was about the importance for sports organizations to serve fans 365 days a year, rather than focus solely on the match days and keep fans engaged around the match days. Obviously, this is easier to do for major sports organizations with large content and digital teams. What I have in mind is obviously the Manchester Uniteds of this world. But what can small clubs do, also Polish clubs do, to keep fans constantly engaged?
I think, to be honest with you, I think you'd be surprised. I think some of the best innovation comes out of the so-called smaller clubs and smaller leagues. I think a lot of the bigger guys have got these enormous teams, but they are not necessarily adding any strategic value. They're creating content for the sake of creating content. There's no strategic intent behind it. I think, we have a saying here that necessity is the mother of all invention, and I think people are very good when their back is against the wall at finding creative and innovative solutions to make things better. And I think certainly clubs and leagues with a smaller broadcast footprint or smaller revenues are the ones that actually have recognised, probably before the big guys, that we're facing a big threat here and we need to do something different. So the principles remain the same. Big budget, big teams doesn't necessarily equal value. It's about understanding who you are, how you are different to other organisations. Most sports clubs in their local markets are really, in revenue terms, no bigger than a small to medium-sized enterprise. But because they're in sport, everyone wants to engage and talk and be a part of that story. And that, for me, is a huge competitive advantage that you would have. The question is then, how do you use that? That increased footprint or that increased level of interest to create value? And I think as well, sport's been pretty bad when you think about the word value in defining it other than revenue terms. What else is valuable? I mean, I've been railing here in the UK for a number of years about the left hand and right hand not speaking. On the left hand, you have the need to engage with younger fans. You need to future-proof your business. On the right hand, you then have clubs selling their media inventory, their main partnership assets to betting companies who legally can't engage with them. And when you think of the revenue that they actually derive from those deals, it's not exactly game-changing. And for me, I think it's going to be interesting to see how particularly smaller clubs become more agile. I've been saying for a number of years that I think at a certain level, sponsorship will become cashless and will become something which is a genuine partnership, where a brand, in return for certain assets, brings reach, it brings content, it brings products and services which actually allow the club themselves to build their own business, rather than just here's some cash up front and then they spend it all on a player. So I think that's going to sharpen people's minds. I think people will be a lot smarter about understanding and defining how value fits in. But it all comes back to a main point, which has been a bugbear of mine for years, is that the word strategy doesn't often appear in sport. And it's one of those things that most people think we haven't got time for a strategy because we're in sales mode. But if you don't take that step back and understand what it is you're trying to achieve, there's no way that you can understand what value is over and above pure revenue terms. It just becomes this self-perpetuating cycle of sell out match day, get to match day, get out the other side of match day, sell out match day, and there's no institutional value being built in the middle. So that's where I think there's a big opportunity, and I think that the post-COVID world is going to reward people who think strategically, who think creatively, who understand that they can bring value in many, many different ways, and that people can bring value to them. And I think, again, I've been saying this for a number of years, even pre-COVID, that this is the age now for marketeers versus salesmen. Marketeers should be creating better products rather than just trying to sell what it is you have now, because that was a limited model even before COVID. However many fans you have X number of seats and Y number of games, and that's your commercial model. Whereas actually, I think thinking differently, thinking more expansively, thinking 365 days a year, and diversifying your business just creates a much higher ceiling for growth.
If the strategy leads to better engagement, I think it's also about sort of trying to collect as much data about your fans. It's also about trying to use this growth and engagement to better understand your fans. What information should the sports organizations be looking to capture about fans and their behavior?
Well, again, that will come back to your strategy. I mean, touching on the word engagement's become this sort of very popular buzzword, and there's lots of people engaging for engagement's sake, and it doesn't actually add up to very much. I mean, engagement is effectively, it's your customer acquisition strategy. It's what we used to call marketing. Yes, I mean, everything has to be geared towards data collection, but that is just the start of it. I mean, if you are collecting data, again, for its own sake, all you're doing is creating a hosting cost. You have to understand what the role of data is and how you're actually going to use that data to drive insight, to create new product and development opportunities, and to start engaging your sponsors in a more meaningful way. So the data requirements will be particular to each different organization's strategy. But again, I come back to the fact that the strategy is a word which is pretty absent in my experience across sport. And, it's very easy for, I've seen it countless times where, marketing, as with things like technology, are mistrusted. They're seen as cost centers. They're not seen as being part of an investment cycle. And as a consequence, no one does it particularly well. It's one of those things that people feel they should be doing. Hey, look, we've got a data system now. We're doing data. Tick that box. Got that one covered. And actually, you're not doing anything. It's not moving the needle anywhere. And as I say, I think this comes back now to when you think of the composition of most sports organizations, it's very sales focused. It's very finance focused. There's always been a real lack of investment into good strategists, marketeers, and technologists. And for me, those are the guys that you need now, because what's pretty clear is the day of the guy just trying to sell what you have is over. We need people to create new products and services, new experiences built on insight, based on what people actually want and understanding what they're prepared to pay for them. And that's going to power innovation and transformation.
Still, for many sponsors, it's still about exposure. And what we've seen here is a lot of sports organizations really struggling to explain to the current and prospective partners that digital assets can be worth as much, if not more, than traditional media assets. But how can you do that when the market is partially still in much?
Well, rights holders, organizations, clubs, etc., they always get a kicking for being pretty uninnovative. But I think there are probably a lot of marketeers in brands who are in a similar space. I mean, what we'd seen over the last 10 years, as we know, is a massive flight of global ad spend, global marketing spend, away from traditional platforms and into the likes of Google, Facebook, and other digital platforms. I think more than half of global marketing spend is now spent through those platforms. That doesn't mean to say that money is being spent smartly. I mean, I have a basic belief that people are inherently lazy, and if there's a way that people can do something which is easy, that they will take it, and that's just human nature, I think. And the great thing about digital platforms is it offers you flexibility, it offers you measurability. But the question is ultimately, is that still the right thing that you actually need? And what we've now got is this sort of Silicon Valley fight to create, who's got the best algorithm, but we're all human beings. And that's where I think, the likes of paid search and paid social, they're very useful and very utilitarian. There is a real lack of emotion around that, which I think sport can bring. If you look, for example, again, I've been saying this for a number of years, that Premier League over here has promoted itself probably in a typically English way, that it's the biggest and best in the world. But if you look at the number of global brands over the last 5 or 6 years that actually sponsor Premier League clubs, it's a pretty small number. That they are shifting their ad spend into other platforms. I don't think that you need to convince too many brands that digital is powerful. What I think the story is ultimately is you're never going to compete as a sporting organization with Google or Facebook or Amazon on a scale perspective. But what you can do is make it very personal to that community of people. And I think if you can ally the basic principles of strong data strategy with a really great customer relationship mentality, and ally that then to the passion of sport and sport's ability to do good and impact people emotionally, that's where I think sport can play. The issue being that we've relied just on the latter, i.e. the passion bit, for far too long. And I think certainly coming out of COVID, I think people will think a lot more rationally, because people have been hard hit by the crisis from a financial perspective. And unless there is actually something there which makes sense both emotionally and rationally, I think it's a very difficult sell. But that's why I think there's a big opportunity for sport. And I think people are getting more and more wary of big tech. And I think if there was another way for brands to be able to create that same hyper-targeted approach to customers, because that's ultimately all brands want, is a way to engage with you at the right time. If you can offer something which is more compelling than big tech, then why would they not look at it?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, as you said at the beginning, you've run marketing and commercial operations for some of the top sporting clubs in the UK. That includes Chelsea, Reading FC, and Bath Rugby. What's one main takeaway from working at those clubs that is still relevant today in this sort of pandemic digital age?
I think it's, Chelsea have got better at it over the years, but I still think fundamentally they are an events business. Sport has always been brilliant at talking about revenue. What it's never really good at talking about is profit. That was certainly the case. I was at Chelsea in the early years after Mr. Abramovich bought the club, and we lost a lot of money. But the focus was always on growing revenues. As someone in a club, you can't, unless you're the chief executive or the owner, you can't worry about whether we've just spent £50 million on a striker. That's nothing to do with you, really. All you can do is find a way to drive revenue up. But even then, when I became head of marketing, my global marketing budget was zero. That has changed. We had to be creative to find ways to build audiences, and I think probably hopefully that's laid the foundations for what they're doing now. But these guys all think like events businesses. There is not a particularly expansive mindset around growing and creating new opportunities. It's mostly around what inventory do we have, how can we move it all around a little bit to try and get an extra 2 or 3% on it, and then it's repeat next season and the season after that. And that for me is a big problem. That's not to say that people haven't recognised that there is that something needs to be done. I certainly think that the likes of Reading and Bath, but also a number of other organisations I've consulted to, the issue is the same everywhere you go. There's no pot of money to invest in this. It's very difficult convincing owners or boards or whatever else to put money aside. And I certainly think this is something that actually I pitched into the Premier League when I was consulting, that they should be exempting investment in brand and customer relationships from financial fair play regulations. They need to be incentivized to do it. Otherwise, they just spend the money on players that they don't always need. But you know, it's that lack of resource, it's the lack of thinking time. You know, not a single one of these clubs hires a person whose job is not linked to match day. You know, at Chelsea, if we lost a game, you know, certainly in the second half of my time there, the owner would call in the chief executive and have a go at him. The chief executive would then call in one of his direct reports and have a go at them. And so on and so on and so on. I mean, I would just go in and take the beating and get on with it, because, you know, it's just one of those things. It was nothing personal, but yeah, that creates a horrible culture. But also, why should ultimately, where it ends up, some poor person trying to sell match day hospitality have their day ruined because the referee missed a last minute handball, or there was an own goal, or whatever else? You know, there's not a single person in any of those organisations whose job is not affected by the result on Saturday. You cannot have a business trying to grow long term when everyone's thinking is so linked to the short term. It needs a big mindset shift.
And looking for inspiration, of course, in recent years we've seen an explosion of interest in esports, and that's also about brands, new renowned brands and blue chip companies that are sort of entering the sponsorship scene, but it's an esports scene rather than sort of traditional sports sponsorship. Yeah. What's esports doing right that traditional sports organizations have failed to do?
Well, I mean, esports is new and shiny, and there's always an excitement amongst people to try new things. I mean, you certainly see all that, you know, when you go on your social media, there's all sorts of people out there talking about esports and AI and blockchain and crypto, and I'm convinced 90% of the people talking about it haven't got a clue what any of those things are, but it sounds fresh and it sounds fun, and hopefully they're trying to convince people that they are sort of experts in those fields. I mean, look, esports is very new, and it's certainly attracting a younger demographic, certainly one which sport has, I think, singularly failed, probably outside of the NBA, to really connect with in a meaningful way. Maybe the NBA in the States and IPL probably in other 2020 cricket around the world. But it's still untested, and I think, you know, there's a real protection of around it of its players. They're very wary of corporate involvement, and I think a lot of brands have tried to get in and done it in the way they would do a traditional market entry and been burnt. So I think that brands are learning about it as well. And I think, like everything, there's parts of esports which are doing things well, and I think there's parts of it which are not doing things well. And as it matures and develops, I think that balance will come. I mean, I can see huge opportunity as we're working with our clients to align esports as a sort of a brand extension of certain sports clubs. It's not going to work everywhere, but it has to be done. It has to be done in a certain way. You know, building up an esports audience and then trying to sell them tickets to come and watch rugby is completely the wrong way to do it. And I've seen some football clubs, going back to my point about data, who, you know, have signed up a FIFA player and put their names on the back of the program and said, hey, look, we're doing esports, and ticking that box, again, creates zero value. You know, and it's my point about people not trusting marketing, not understanding it, but just sort of jumping on the latest bandwagon and ticking a box. It creates no value. So I think sports and esports are still sort of, I mean, you're not really comparing the same thing. I think they're good and bad in both. I think esports is just very, very new, and we're all learning about it as we go. And yeah, they are doing lots of good things, and because they're fresh and fun, you know, lots of people are trying them out. But I think there will probably be a sort of a rationalization over time. and it may well be that there's room for everyone, and esports can learn from sports in the same way that the other way around is true as well.
And my final question is about the future. What makes me wonder is that some analysts are saying the industry, the sports industry, is going to bounce back very strongly when the pandemic is brought under control. Whereas another group of analysts is saying, come on, guys, it's actually going to take years for sports organizations to recover. What's your view on this? Which side are you on?
Well, we're a challenger brand at PTI Digital, and I have to be honest. We are, one of our core tenets is that we would much rather tell our clients an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie. And there are a lot of organisations out there who are really embedded in the industry, been around a lot longer than we have, and who have an investment in the status quo being as it is. We see a huge challenge in the next 6, 12, 18, and maybe even 24, 36 months. And I think it's one of those things where, I look back to 2008 when the banking crash happened, and a lot of people lost their jobs. There was a huge squeeze on cash and liquidity in the economy. In the UK, I remember season tickets pretty much held up pretty well. I think it was probably the thing that people let go of last, because that's where they vented their fury on a Saturday, sort of how difficult their week had been. But if you add in a financial crisis, and by the way, I don't think we've even seen the tip of the economic impact of this crisis yet. If you add the financial impact to a nervousness that a lot of people are going to have, we were just talking about it before we came on this call. Season ticket holders in the UK and generally around the world tend to be older men who've been the hardest hit from a health perspective by this crisis. And the audiences that we need to engage, the younger ones, are the ones that have been hardest hit financially. And they're also the audience that have spent the time on esports and gaming. We've seen the numbers of those increase. So you've got, I think you've got a financial impact. I think you've got a psychological impact. But I also think another big difference between now and 2008 is that people have had a year away from doing what their routine was, and they will have found other ways to spend their time and money, and they'll have had a lot of time to think. I remember, one of a man saying to me who had 4 tickets in a diamond club at Arsenal, and he just got sent a renewal form over the summer, and he rang them up and said, but this is £25,000 for these 4 seats. How's it going to work with COVID? And they hadn't even thought about it. And he said, but you can't treat me like, you can't just expect to take my £25,000 without giving me some form of understanding of how this is going to work. And I think a lot of people will have reconsidered what's important about how they spend their time and their money. And so I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I genuinely do. I think there's going to be a long tail in the corporate market. Brands will have an awful lot of time to think about their strategies. And when there's been economic downturns in the past, there's a lot of proof which suggests those companies which invest in their brand and in their customers are the ones that come out quickest and with the greatest strength over a longer period of time. And so brands will have had time to think about how they respond to the post-COVID world. So if you're not adding value, if you're not part of that value mix for them, then you're going to lose out. So I think sport faces an existential crisis. I really do. I think sport was struggling even before COVID for all the reasons that I outlined in my presentation. But I also think that the post-COVID world is the perfect excuse now, and there can be no excuse. I mean, what is it going to take for organizations to transition away from an inelastic 20, 30 day a year business, which is effectively the yield management business, into one which is more dynamic? If a global pandemic which shuts down the entire world for a year isn't going to force people to rethink, well, as one of the MD of one of our clients said, you've had your head down the toilet if you still don't think you need to do something different. So, yeah, I mean, I think telling everyone it's all going to be fine, I think is poor advice. I think as with everything, when there's an economic downturn, I think there's always either a flight to quality or a flight to price. And if you are a high-end premium experience, you can probably still charge a premium price. If you are a low-end, low-cost experience, I think, again, there's opportunity there. I think if you're sitting in the middle offering a pretty poor experience, but you're still quite expensive, I think you've got a really, really difficult next 2 or 3 years ahead of you. So it's time to take a step back and think about all the things we've just been talking about, and work out what your plan is for the next 10 years, because I can see a lot of clubs going out of business. I mean, just look what's happening in France at the moment with their TV deals. I mean, it's extraordinary. There's a huge amount of change in our industry, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be really, really tough for the majority.
Excellent, fantastic insights, Ben. Thank you very much. I'm sure this is going to be very useful for everyone who's listening to us at the moment, but I certainly hope that we can see each other live next year at
that would be great.
Sport Business Congress, Sport Business Poland Congress 2022. So hopefully we can count on your presence.
That would be wonderful, yes. In typical Zoom fashion, I've just been joined in my office by both my dogs. So it's quite a weird thing to get used to now, isn't it? But yeah, it's been really nice chatting, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Ben. Thanks a lot.